Napoleon thought he was fighting a war against the British army, but he was actually fighting a war against his own economy. The bullets that destroyed his empire were bought with gold that was smuggled out of his own capital city by bankers who cared more about profit than patriotism. This is Tom, from the Collapse Log, exploring the rise and fall of empires. Because behind every golden age lies a quiet decay no one sees until it is too late. The year is 1814. The wars of Napoleon have ravaged Europe for over a decade. From the burning sands of Egypt to the frozen wastelands of Russia, the French emperor has reshaped the world in his image. He has toppled kings. He has dissolved borders. He has rewritten the laws of nations. But now the tide has turned. The Grand Army lies buried under the Russian snow. The coalition of European powers is closing in on Paris from the east. And in the south, the British army led by the Duke of Wellington has crossed the Pyrenees Mountains and is standing on French soil. It should have been the final blow. Wellington was poised to march north and crush the remaining French resistance. But the Iron Duke, as he was known, was paralyzed. He wasn't stopped by a French fortress. He wasn't stopped by a brilliant maneuver from Marshal Soult. He was stopped by something far more mundane and far more deadly. He was broke. The British government in London had spent nearly 20 years funding the war against France. They had subsidized the armies of Russia and Austria and Prussia. They had built the greatest navy the world had ever seen. But they had run out of one critical resource: gold. Great Britain had moved to a paper currency system years earlier to keep the war economy moving. The Bank of England had suspended the payment of gold to its citizens. In London, paper money worked fine. But you cannot invade a hostile country with paper money. A French farmer in 1814 did not want a piece of paper signed by a British banker. He wanted gold. He wanted silver. He wanted hard currency that he could bite to make sure it was real. Wellington understood the rules of invasion better than anyone. He knew that if his soldiers could not buy food, they would steal it. If they started looting the French countryside, the French population would rise up in a guerrilla war. Wellington needed to win the hearts and minds of the French people. He needed to show them that the British were not conquerors, but liberators coming to free them from the tyranny of Napoleon. To do that, he had to pay for everything. Every loaf of bread, every bottle of wine, every bundle of hay for the horses. He needed millions of gold coins, and he needed them immediately. But the vaults in London were empty. The British government was in a panic. They had the winning army, but they couldn't afford to move it 1 inch. This is the moment where the sword bowed to the ledger. The British Commissary-in-Chief, a man named John Charles Herries, realized that the government bureaucracy was too slow and too clumsy to solve this problem. He needed a miracle. So he summoned a man who lived outside the traditional power structures of the British aristocracy. He summoned Nathan Mayer Rothschild. Nathan Rothschild was a Jewish banker from Frankfurt who had settled in London. He was an outsider. He was viewed with suspicion by the old money elites, but he possessed two things that the British government desperately lacked. He had a genius for understanding currency arbitrage, and he had a family. The Rothschild family was unique in history. Nathan had brothers stationed in the major financial capitals of Europe. Salomon was in Vienna. Karl was in Naples. Amschel was in Frankfurt. And most importantly for this story, James de Rothschild was in Paris. They operated as a single entity, a multinational corporation, before the concept even existed. They communicated with secret codes and private couriers. They could move money faster than any government. When Herries explained the problem to Nathan Rothschild, the banker saw the opportunity of a lifetime. The British government needed to send massive amounts of gold to Wellington in the south of France. But where could they find that much gold? The mines of Spanish America were disrupted by revolutions. The vaults of Amsterdam were dry. Nathan Rothschild looked at the map, and he realized the irony. There was only one place in Europe that had enough gold to pay for Wellington's army: France. Napoleon had always distrusted paper money. He had seen the chaos of the French Revolution when the paper assignats became worthless. So he had insisted on a hard money economy. He hoarded gold. The Bank of France in Paris was sitting on a mountain of gold Napoleons and silver francs. Rothschild came up with a plan that was so audacious, it bordered on treason. He would take British government paper bonds sold in London and use them to buy gold in Paris right under Napoleon's nose. Then he would smuggle that gold out of Paris through the French lines and into the hands of the British general who was coming to kill Napoleon. It sounds impossible. Why would the French let their enemy buy their gold? This is where the quiet decay of the empire becomes visible. By 1814, the French business class had lost faith in Napoleon. They saw endless war. They saw the blockade destroying their trade. They saw their sons being drafted to die in battles that couldn't be won. The French bankers and merchants didn't care about the glory of the empire anymore. They cared about survival. They cared about profit. When agents of the Rothschilds appeared in Paris offering stable British bills of exchange for French gold, the French bankers didn't ask questions. They took the deal.
James de Rothschild, the youngest brother, was living in Paris. He was the linchpin of the operation. He moved through the salons of the French capital, charming the officials and bribing the bureaucrats. He managed to convince the French finance ministry that letting gold flow out of France was actually a good thing. He spun a complex economic theory. He told them that by selling gold to the British, they were draining Britain of its wealth.
He argued that if the British were foolish enough to give valuable credit notes in exchange for metal, France should take the deal to weaken the British pound. The French officials, blinded by their own arrogance and perhaps by a few well-placed bribes, agreed. They unknowingly authorized the export of the very capital that would fund their own destruction. It is a testament to the fact that financial literacy is often the greatest weakness of military dictators. Napoleon understood artillery trajectories perfectly, but he did not understand the flow of capital. So the smuggling operation began. It was the greatest logistical feat of the war. It wasn't moving cannons or men, it was moving money. The gold was collected in Paris. It was packed into nondescript crates. It was loaded onto carriages, but they couldn't just drive it to Wellington. The front lines were a chaotic war zone, so they had to take the long way around. The Rothschild network moved the gold from Paris to the French coast. There, under the cover of darkness, and often with the help of bribed French customs officers, it was loaded onto small, fast boats. These boats slipped through the English Channel blockade not to go to England, but to go to the Dutch coast, or sometimes directly to ports in Spain and Portugal that were held by the British. Sometimes they used an even more direct route. They disguised the gold shipments as commercial goods destined for neutral merchants in the south of France. The gold literally traveled through the French postal system and private courier networks. The French police were guarding the roads looking for British spies, but they waved through the carriages carrying the gold that would pay the British soldiers. Nathan Rothschild in London was the conductor of this symphony. He was buying up gold coins everywhere he could find them. He bought guineas, he bought doubloons, he bought Friedrich's d'Or. He bought huge quantities of silver. He calculated the exchange rates in his head. He knew that if he bought too much too quickly, the price would spike and the British government would go broke. So he bought in secret. He used agents to hide his movements. He manipulated the market to keep the price of gold low while he accumulated a hoard. The sheer volume of wealth being moved was staggering. In a period of just a few months, the Rothschilds moved the equivalent of millions of pounds sterling in physical metal. This was a time when a few shillings was a weekly wage for a laborer. We are talking about billions of dollars in modern value. The gold eventually reached the hands of the Duke of Wellington. The effect was immediate. The British Army became the richest customer in the south of France. When Wellington's troops marched into a French village, they didn't kick down doors and steal chickens. They went to the market and they pulled out gold coins. The French peasants who had been taxed into poverty by Napoleon and had their crops requisitioned by the French army suddenly found themselves doing the best business of their lives. They looked at the British soldiers, and they didn't see invaders. They saw customers. They saw salvation. The farmers brought out their hidden stores of grain. The butchers brought out their meat. The British army was well fed and high on morale. The local population refused to fight for Napoleon. Why would they fight the men who were paying them in solid gold? This is the ultimate irony of the war. The French economy was keeping the British army alive. Napoleon was sitting in his palace at Fontainebleau, moving pins on a map, trying to figure out how to maneuver his shrinking army. He was counting muskets and sabres, but he failed to count the coins. He didn't realize that his own capital city had become the supply depot for his enemy. He didn't realize that the bankers he despised had built a pipeline of cash that bypassed his blockade and his armies. As Wellington pushed north, the resistance crumbled. It wasn't just a military collapse, it was a collapse of loyalty. The French elites saw the writing on the wall. They knew that the British credit was good and the Napoleonic credit was bad. They were hedging their bets. Nathan Rothschild famously said that money has no fatherland. In 1814, he proved it. The gold did not care who wore the crown. It flowed to where the power was rising, and it fled from where the power was falling. When the Allies finally entered Paris, the Rothschilds were there. They hadn't fired a shot, but they had done more to defeat Napoleon than any regiment of cavalry. They had proven that in the modern world, war is not just a test of courage, it is a test of credit. The British government was astounded by what Nathan Rothschild had achieved. John Charles Herries later admitted that without the Rothschilds, the war could not have been won. The Duke of Wellington himself said that the Rothschilds helped him more than the government did. But there is a darker side to this story. It reveals the terrifying power of the financial class. A single family of bankers had the power to decide the fate of nations. They could move the lifeblood of war across borders at will. They operated above the law and above the conflict. While young men were dying in the mud of the battlefield for flags and for honor, the gold was moving silently in the shadows for profit. The Rothschilds made a fortune on these transactions. They charged a commission on every coin. They profited from the exchange rates. They built the foundation of a dynasty that would dominate European finance for a century. Napoleon was exiled to Elba and later to St. Helena. He spent his final years writing his memoirs trying to explain his defeat. He blamed the winter in Russia. He blamed the betrayal of his marshals. He blamed the stubbornness of the British. But he rarely spoke about the banking system. Perhaps he never truly understood what had happened to him. He was the last of the great conquerors of the old world men who believed that power came from the sword. He was defeated by the first conquerors of the new world men who knew that power comes from the ledger. The smuggler's route of 1814 was the birth of the modern global financial system. It was the moment when capital declared its independence from the state. It showed that money is a fluid force that cannot be contained by borders or blockades or ideologies. Today we see the same patterns. We see sanctions and trade wars. We see assets being frozen and currency being weaponized. We think these are tools of the state. But behind the scenes, the money is still moving. There is always a smuggler's route. There is always a back door. When a country is sanctioned, there is always a banker willing to move the money for a price. When a war is declared, there is always a profit to be made by supplying both sides or by funding the winner. The story of French gold paying for Napoleon's defeat is a warning to anyone who believes in the absolute power of the state. You can have the secret police and the grand army. You can have the monuments and the propaganda. But if the money decides to leave, you are finished. Napoleon thought he was the master of France, but he was just a tenant. The landlords were the men who held the keys to the vaults, and when the tenants stopped paying the rent, the landlords evicted him. The quiet decay of the French Empire didn't look like a rotting building. It looked like a carriage rolling out of Paris in the middle of the night, carrying a box of gold coins destined for the pocket of a British soldier. It looked like business as usual. And that is why no one saw it until it was too late. The next time you watch a war unfold on the news, look past the tanks and the missiles. Look for the money. Ask yourself where the gold is flowing. Ask yourself who is getting rich and who is going broke. Because the soldier may pull the trigger, but the banker buys the bullet. And sometimes, as Napoleon found out, the bullet is bought with your own money. This is the reality of the collapse. It is not always a bang. Sometimes it is the sound of a coin dropping into a purse. And that sound is the death knell of empires.